truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, June 6th, 2024, the 1,233rd day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. With a paid subscription, you get the ad-free experience. You can participate in the conversation on Substack and join in the interactive live streams every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack or a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. So we are having one of those weeks where there are so many things happening that it is going to be impossible to get to all of them, even though some of them are legitimately important and track narratives that we've been following for years. Some of those are still in process. The layers will develop over the next few days and weeks, and we will be certain to fold those in. So I want to give a brief mention to some of those just to make sure they're on your radar, and then we will continue along with some of these elections happening around the world, most particularly India. We talked at length on Tuesday about the election that just happened over the weekend in Mexico, some of the reaction to that. Joe Biden yesterday released his proclamation that is being widely referred to as an executive order, even though it is not. He is going to pretend to have solved the immigration problem at the southern border after saying throughout the approval process for Mike Johnson's package that he was going to need help from Congress, from the Senate, in order to be able to shut down the border and solve the border problem. But the legislative branch will be no help on that. So now he's just going to go it alone. His plan also is not capable of fixing anything. So when we are told that the border problem has been fixed, it's important to know that neither Joe Biden nor the illegitimate legislature had anything to do with it. That means it was done either by Donald Trump or by the Mexican government or by a combination of the two. And as we discussed on Tuesday, that can happen even when the Mexican president is a Mexican Jewish leftist climate activist, so long as her greater priorities are populism and nationalism and sovereignty. We will get back into that in a little bit. Yesterday, the WHO told us that there was going to be a new virus out in the world. We heard it was going to be H5N1 bird flu. It turns out that it's H5N2 bird flu, which means it's like the novel coronavirus. This is something we've never seen before. We're not prepared for this. They had some version of Dr. Deborah Birx on television yesterday suggesting that what we need to do is give PCR tests that don't work to every single cow in the country and every dairy and poultry worker as well. Just get all those tests out there, get millions and billions and zillions of positives, and then everybody's going to know that there's a very deadly pandemic around. The WHO is warning us that a 59-year-old man died in Mexico from the H5N2 bird flu. He died near the end of April. So it's been 6 weeks. They're just telling us now. Let's get that pandemic started. We are also being told that U.S. weapons have been used by Ukraine to attack Russia in Russian territory. And I guess that means that we are starting the World War III that we couldn't get Russia to start. I think we might discuss more of that tomorrow. We've had Donald Trump convicted, and we still have issues about the gag order, apparently, that was supposed to be in place so that the jury would be safe and unaffected while they did their very important work of convicting Donald Trump for crimes that absolutely no one can describe. But if you're going to be corrupt hypocrites, you certainly don't want the loudest voice in the world calling that out constantly. So they're attempting to keep a gag order on Donald Trump while the fake president's degenerate son, Hunter Biden, is in court for gun charges, and he is almost guaranteed to get off on those charges. He also should, because there should not be all these gun laws to violate. He'll probably get off on tax charges too, and we should be okay with that as well. We want to see corrupt political criminals held accountable and punished for their corruption and their political crimes. We want to see these people imprisoned, perhaps, but not for breaking laws that shouldn't be laws in the first place. We heard this week that Judge Aileen Cannon was going to hear arguments about Jack Smith's legitimacy as a special counsel and his ability to bring these cases against Donald Trump in the first place. I have a feeling that's going to be a rug pull on us that will eventually benefit us in the future. And we also heard that the Fani Willis trial in Fulton County, Georgia, will not begin until this fall at the earliest. That has been put on pause indefinitely as they decide whether or not Fani Willis should be disqualified. And there is, of course, the issue of Donald Trump's immunity before the Supreme Court right now. The fact that the two Jack Smith cases and the Fani Willis case will not be heard before the election means that if the regime wants to put Donald Trump in prison, they're going to have to do it on the basis of the decision in the Law and Order New York loudest hush money trial, which, despite the protestations of the television characters in mainstream media, is viewed by virtually everyone in this country and around the world as a totally illegitimate political persecution and prosecution, cementing the idea that if Donald Trump is thrown in prison at all, it will only make things worse for the regime. In addition, Steve Bannon has been ordered to go to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200 on July 1st by federal judge Carl Nichols. So if Bannon is going to keep himself out of prison, it has to happen by then. Bannon's friend and sometimes substitute war room host, Peter Navarro, is going to be getting out of prison in the middle of July. So I imagine he'll probably take over much of the war room hosting responsibility after he and Steve Bannon have swapped positions, if indeed that is what happens. Bannon is supposed to go for 4 months, so he would be coming out right around the election, and he would be available to handle that post-election period, which is going to be even more important than the run-up to the election, I imagine. But let's transition our way back into our discussion of elections around the world by sharing some monumental freak out about elections here at home. This is Marc Elias on his website, democracydocket.com. This is from yesterday. Donald Trump is plotting his next crime. In 2016, Donald Trump seemed to pull an inside straight by narrowly winning Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, while losing the popular vote by 3 million. We now know Trump committed 34 felonies to win that election. Okay, so the crimes for which Donald Trump was, quote unquote, convicted by this kangaroo court, virtually everyone knows that was illegitimate and that it will be overturned. That was all done after the election. We are being told that all of it was to cover up the story about Stormy Daniels, even though the affair never happened. That would have made the difference in the election. Therefore, Donald Trump committed those crimes to steal this election, according to Marc Elias. Why doesn't anyone fact check this crazy man? Marc Elias, of course, in his time at Perkins Coie, was involved in actually attempting to rig the 2016 election on behalf of Hillary Clinton by employing the Steele dossier and the Russia collusion claims. He operates the lawfare apparatus that ensures when elections are stolen by the uniparty, they remain stolen, that the courts do not overturn any of the results they've achieved. But no, it is Donald Trump who steals elections. Elias writes, without these crimes, he seems almost certain to have lost to Hillary Clinton. She would have been sworn in on January 20th, 2017. She would have filled 2 Supreme Court vacancies and enacted her legislative agenda. Roe v. Wade would have never been overturned. The progress made under the Obama administration would have been continued. Following a global pandemic, millions might still be alive. So all of those millions who are dead from hospital malpractice and data manipulation were actually killed by Donald Trump because he committed those 34 bookkeeping errors, calling a legal expense, thus winning the election, mishandling COVID, causing those millions to die, even though the very deadly pandemic was not what killed them. This is insane, but there are people out there who believe this shit. As we reflect on the outcome of the New York trial, we should pause to acknowledge that history was tragically derailed by Trump's felonious conduct. Trump continued his election crime spree in 2020. This time it largely took place in the aftermath of an election he was surprised he did not win. When his frivolous legal attacks failed to overturn the result of President Joe Biden's 7 million vote victory, he resorted to fake electors, racketeering, and insurrection. While criminal trials in those cases have been delayed, the evidence is overwhelming. His defense to the Washington, D.C. criminal case hinges on a theory of presidential immunity that would allow presidents to assassinate their political opponents and stage coups. This is nutso. At the outset of his candidacy, the media discounted his bravado that he, quote, could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, end quote, and wouldn't lose any voters. At the time, we were told to take Trump seriously, but not literally. History has shown that was a mistake. Yes, Mark, history has shown that no matter how you take Donald Trump's words, you are always making a mistake. Career criminals rarely stop unless they are apprehended and punished. Narcissistic authoritarians feed off abusing power and violating norms and laws. Sociopaths never develop a conscience. The morning after his criminal conviction in New York, Trump gave a rambling speech attacking the judicial system and lying about the verdict, prosecutors, and judge. Was it Trump doing that, or is Marc Elias doing that right here? Buried in his remarks was this line: "I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to save our country and save our Constitution." In an interview with Fox News, he warned that the public might not stand for a criminal punishment. He ominously predicted that at a certain point, there's a breaking point. When Donald Trump says he will do whatever he has to do, he means it as a threat. When he talks about breaking points, he is threatening violence. Trump has already told us he will only accept the outcome of the 2024 election if he wins. He recently claimed he won Minnesota in 2020. In fact, he lost by over 200,000 votes. I guess we'll see, won't we, Mark? He is claiming that absent fraud, he will win New York and New Jersey in 2024. That's correct. He also won them in 2020. They had to rig and steal the governor's election in 2021 in New Jersey to keep uniparty superstar Phil Murphy in office because the deep blue New Jersey was prepared to throw him out. That story, of course, got lost in all the hype about Glenn Youngkin winning in Virginia in an obviously rigged election that was designed just to push narratives to keep the election fraud apparatus in place. Don't you see? A Republican won. Democrats are so unpopular that they cannot win even in their deep blue states without cheating. There's no such thing as a deep blue state. Trump is planning his next crime. We don't know the exact details, but we know it involves subverting the will of voters and undermining free and fair elections. And we know that he will spare nothing and no one who gets in his way. Already, his campaign and their allies are suing states to throw out election rules, to sow chaos by throwing out the rules by which elections are conducted. Well, that is quite a sentence. They're suing states to throw out election rules to sow chaos by throwing out the rules by which elections are conducted. I think he must mean election rules. They are litigating to criminalize voter registration, increase the number of ballots that are discarded, and purge voters. That's because those things contain rampant illegalities. Perhaps most chilling, they assert a constitutional right to harass election officials and voters. Yes, people do have the right to monitor what public officials are doing and to criticize them. That is true, Marc Elias. Most importantly for this fall, Trump and his allies are focused on empowering election deniers to refuse to certify election results. They tried this in a handful of places after the 2020 election. Now they are far more organized. Democracy is in far more danger. This time, Trump will have more willing accomplices, more committed conspirators. Rather than a misfit band of lawyers and a handful of sycophants, this time he will have nearly every Republican senator, congressman, governor, and state attorney general at his disposal. His grassroots army of followers is more primed to take extreme action, including violence. Again, no, we don't need that. We're just going to make sure that absolutely everyone knows who you are and what you are doing, Marc Elias, and things are going to be just fine. Meanwhile, too many elites in politics and the media insist that the threat is overblown. Over expensive wine and canapes, they denounce partisanship as the real evil. They take pride in seeing two sides where there is only one, shades of gray where there is only black and white. They smugly ignore the possibility and consequences if they are wrong. If Donald Trump succeeds, there will be no justice for him. He will become the autocrat he promises to his supporters. The rule of law and democracy will be irreparably damaged. Trump is plotting his next crime. We must do everything we can to prevent it. And that, my friends, is some rather extraordinary projection. To the extent that Marc Elias believes any of that, Marc Elias would be suffering under a total inversion within the false reality. His readers, unfortunately, believe all of that. They have no attachment to reality whatsoever. Many of them actually believe Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. That degree of panic was shared by none other than Andrew McCabe on CNN with Caitlin Collins. You'll remember a few weeks back, we discussed how one of the topics of conversation at DC cocktail parties is where people planned to flee to, which countries would be their destinations when Donald Trump came back in office, and they wanted to avoid accountability or even avoid the responsibility of having to answer questions about what their friends and allies have done. They were following the laws so carefully, and they are so patriotic, and they respect democracy so much that Donald Trump winning an election, which would have to be free and fair, of course, and then following the law would cause them to abandon America, flee the country, and go into hiding, rather than allowing our very legitimate judicial system to do its work and make sure that no one is above the law. Here's McCabe.
It's great to have you here because few people know the inner workings of the FBI better than you do. And you've also personally experienced the pressure from Donald Trump. And when you see him promising this wholesale takeover of the Justice Department, I wonder how you worry about what that would look like.
Yeah, Caitlin, I mean, I worry a lot about it. And I think it's, when you think about these things and you try to predict how Donald Trump is going to react or the steps he's going to take, you really don't have to go any further than listening to the things he says and does. I mean, his comments recently are offensive and horrendous, but they're not surprising in any way. He's been saying this for quite some time. I will be your retribution is his refrain to his supporters. So, you know him, you know what motivates him. He is not a person who's driven by principle or ideology. He is someone who's entirely transactional. And if he feels like he's been wronged in some way, then he focuses on revenge and vengeance. And so he's made it perfectly clear that that's what he's going to do. And in the process of seeking that, he is going to he runs the risk of really dismantling and greatly incapacitating the Department of Justice and the FBI. And that is something that Americans on both sides of the political aisle should be worried about. Yeah. We depend on those institutions to protect us.
Well, what do you think
and he is proposing to tear them down.
We depend on these institutions to protect us, and he is proposing to tear them down. To protect who? Is he imagining that he speaks for the American people? Do you think that the system of justice, that our institutions exist to protect you? I don't feel protected by my institutions. In fact, I feel that the greatest threat to my life, my property, my liberty, my justice, my pursuit of happiness, the greatest threat to all of those things happens to be our institutions. Donald Trump's mandate will be to tear them down, or at least to remove the infiltration and the corruption and radically diminish the power these institutions hold to govern our lives. This country was created and founded to protect liberty, not to implement a long-term global, one-world, international rules-based order and its agenda. All right, so on to our international elections. Let's start with this from Axios on Tuesday. Surprise election results in Mexico and India leave international investors reeling. Wow. The winner of Mexico's election, Claudia Sheinbaum, was expected to win by a large margin, and she won by a large margin. So why are they surprised by this? And as we get into this, keep in mind that when you see a reaction from the global regime or institutions of the global regime, it should be understood that they didn't get what they wanted, what they thought they were going to get. Stocks and currencies plunged in both countries as India Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party lost its parliamentary stronghold and Claudia Sheinbaum won by a landslide victory in Mexico. Sheinbaum's victory was priced in, but a near supermajority was not. While in India, a very large Modi victory was priced in rather than a modest majority, according to a note today by Bespoke Investment Group. In Mexico and India, two developing economies with deep ties to the U.S., investors want to see government policies that bolster business. According to the United Nations, by the way, developing economies are low and middle income countries with relatively low levels of industrialization and human development, whatever human development is supposed to mean. In Mexico, investors fear The ruling party will pass constitutional reforms without any checks from the opposition, leading to a less business-friendly environment, according to a separate note by Bespoke. We talked about that a bit the other day. There's going to be that period where all the new winners have been inaugurated except for Sheinbaum. So AMLO, the Trump ally, will be president and have everything at his disposal to implement his agenda while Sheinbaum is on the way in. Less business-friendly in this parlance means that the country will be less welcoming to the influence of the global regime money that supports the implementation of the global regime agenda into a country. When the regime has a country properly under control, they flood all sorts of money in, bringing in all of the regime transnational corporations, setting the society up as the quote-unquote democracy that we are all so familiar with. If they don't have their people in place, that money doesn't flow in. It sounds as though their plans have been thwarted. In India, Modi will have a weakened mandate, and that will make the passage of contentious economic reforms more difficult, according to a note from Capital Economics. The Sensex, an India index not unlike the American Dow, plunged more than 5.7%. This again is on Tuesday, in its worst daily showing since May 2020, though that was after a nearly 4% jump a day earlier. The S&P BMV IPC, an index that tracks major Mexican stocks, fell by 6.1% on Monday in the worst decline since the pandemic crash. Axios writes, in Mexico, Sheinbaum is expected to maintain the course set by her predecessor and ally, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. S&P Global Ratings doesn't believe that the new administration is likely to materially change the country's fiscal, monetary, or trade policies. And Sheinbaum will be under pressure to grow an economy that increased by only 3.1% in 2023, the ratings agency said in a report. Meanwhile, Modi will still remain in power as head of a stable coalition, with Capital Economics saying that its broader embrace of the value of economic reforms could still translate to growth at 6 to 7%. So the market reaction is what indicates the surprise. They assumed a different result. Sure, Modi was strong in India. Sheinbaum was an overwhelming favorite in Mexico, but down ballot, they thought they would achieve different results. And maybe we'll have to get into some of the down ballot stuff in Mexico over the next days and weeks. Who knows? There is just way too much going on, honestly. Let's stick with Axios. This is from today. Voters everywhere rage against the incumbents. Across Europe, parties in power are bracing for a drubbing in this week's elections for European Parliament, in many cases at the hands of far-right populists. 4 years of successive crises, a global pandemic, large-scale war in Europe for the first time in decades, and debilitating inflation are fueling anti-incumbent backlash in the biggest election year in human history. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been described as the most popular leader in the world, but even he was humbled by election results this week. He'll keep his job, but without an outright majority. Last week in South Africa, the long-ruling African National Congress suffered its worst performance since the end of apartheid. Ruling parties from South Korea to Senegal have suffered recent defeats. Next month, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives are on course to be wiped out in a landslide. And the fake and illegitimate President Joe Biden is trailing President Donald Trump in most polls. Biden's approval rating is stuck in the high 30s, and even that is better than leaders like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at 35%, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at 26%, French President Emmanuel Macron at 23%, or Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at 15%, according to Morning Consult's tracker. Isn't it weird that some of the world's greatest democracies are being led by leaders who are opposed by the vast majority of the people they're supposed to be leading? There are names for systems like that. Democracy isn't generally one of them, nor is republic. The most popular leader on the tracker, aside from Modi, is Argentina's Javier Milei at 61%, a self-described anarcho-capitalist who was swept to office in December on a burn-it-all-down platform. And he may well have been swept into office by an information operation, because that dude is not real. Mexico defied that trend last week by electing an ally of President AMLO, Claudia Sheinbaum. Before that, incumbents in Latin America had lost 20 elections in a row. Mainstream parties are seeking to slow a populist surge in the EU's parliamentary elections, in which 373 million people will be eligible to vote in 27 countries between Thursday and Sunday. In Germany, the Social Democrats, who lead a strained and unpopular coalition government, are hoping that late-breaking scandals will prevent the far-right AfD from making huge gains. Late-breaking scandals. In America, we call that an October surprise. We should now recognize all of those things specifically only as information operations, narrative deployments designed to produce an outcome that can only be achieved through election fraud. The scandals and controversies are generated by regime media, and then when the impossible results of the elections are achieved and reported to the public, all of that goes along with voters just really change their minds at the last second, understanding that candidate XYZ had done all these very bad things. At this point, you don't even need to know what the scandal is to know the scandal is bullshit. One top social democrat borrowed one of Biden's favorite quips in a meeting with Axios this week. Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. Like, sure, I'm a piece of shit, but did you hear what the television has told you about the other guy? In France, the far-right National Rally leads comfortably in the polls and is casting the elections as a referendum on the term-limited Macron. In the Netherlands, anti-Islam campaigner Geert Wilders pulled off a shock upset last November, making his party the biggest in parliament. He's now seeking to carry that momentum into the European elections. German Social Democrat Matthias Ecke, an EU candidate who was attacked last month by teens with suspected far-right ties, said he believes the radicalizing effect of the pandemic has been underestimated. It's really contributed to a larger share of the population that's open to the idea of anti-democratic forces, Ecke told Axios, citing a, quote, rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, end quote, that sprouted from vaccines and lockdowns. No, it didn't. It sprouted from everybody's ability to access information and the understanding of censorship and propaganda. COVID just sent everything into warp speed as people began to feel the effects of the agenda in their lives and wanted to know how that agenda could be stopped and who they should be stopping in order to stop that agenda. And hey, Matthias, turns out it's you. There are clearly divergent factors driving down support for social democrats in Germany and Modi's Hindu nationalists in India. Even within the West, analysts debate whether social media and disinformation are making voters angrier or economic insecurity is largely to blame. The bottom line, it's a bad time to be running for re-election just about anywhere. All right, so let's get into India and start with the central narrative. Let's get the official story from the New York Times. This is the headline on Tuesday. Needing help to stay in power, Modi loses his aura of invincibility. Suddenly, the aura of invincibility around Narendra Modi has been shattered. In an Indian election in which his party's slogan had promised a landslide victory, and Mr. Modi even repeatedly referred to himself as sent by God, the results announced on Tuesday were unexpectedly sobering. Now, I want to pause already to focus in on this line. In an Indian election in which his party's slogan had promised a landslide victory. That sounds a lot like Donald Trump saying, too big to rig, does it not? Mr. Modi, 73, appeared to secure a third consecutive term as prime minister, a feat that only one other Indian leader has accomplished, and his Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, gained far more seats than any other party. But instead of a runaway win, the BJP lost dozens of seats. It now finds itself at the mercy of coalition partners, including one politician notorious for how often he has switched sides to stay in power. A sharp reversal a decade into Mr. Modi's transformational tenure. As the results came into view, the country's stock markets plunged. Opposition parties, newly unified in what they had called an effort to save the country's democracy, rejoiced. And India, while extending Mr. Modi's firm hold on power, learned that there are limits to his political potency, even as he made the election, usually fought seat by seat, squarely about himself. We have talked many times about how the same narrative playbook plays out all across the world, different countries, cyclically, slight variations in each country, obvious variations along the timeline, but it is easy to view this in parallel. Modi's opponents are trying to save democracy. We are being told the election was made all about the leading figure, in this case, Modi being the parallel to Donald Trump. And while Modi still has power, things down ballot, they're not looking so pretty. Mr. Modi took a more positive view in a statement on X, formerly Twitter, declaring that his coalition had won a third term. This is a historical feat in India's history, he said. For Mr. Modi, a generous reading of the outcome could be that only with his personal push could his party overcome its unpopularity at the local level and scrape by. Or it could be that his carefully cultivated brand has now peaked and that he can no longer outrun the anti-incumbency sentiment that eventually catches up with almost any politician. Keep these narratives in mind. We're going to hear them this fall. How Mr. Modi will react is uncertain. Whether he will harden his effort to turn away any challenge to his power or be chastened by the voters' verdict and his need to work with coalition partners that do not share his Hindu nationalist ideology. There it is again. Nationalism, always the problem. Modi is not known as a consensual figure. However, he is very pragmatic, said Arati Jarath, a political analyst based in New Delhi. He will have to moderate his hardline Hindu nationalist approach to issues. Perhaps we can hope for more moderation from him. Again, expect to be told this fall that Americans want divided government. They know that Donald Trump is going to win because Joe Biden is viewed as unsuccessful. And amid the controversy and his late stage in life, he's just simply unfit for the role right now. But that doesn't mean the country supports Trump. What they want is the moderate position, the centrist ideals. Few doubt, however, that Mr. Modi will try to deepen his already considerable imprint on the country over the next 5 years. On his watch, India, the world's most populous nation, has enjoyed newfound prominence on the global stage, overhauled its infrastructure for the needs of its 1.4 billion people, and been imbued with a new sense of ambition as it tries to shed the legacy of its long colonial past. Man, I hope one day we're able to do that too. And I guess congratulations to India for becoming more populous than China. At the same time, Mr. Modi has worked to turn a vastly diverse country held together by a secular democratic system into an overtly Hindu-first state, marginalizing the country's large Muslim minority. And of course, consider all the times we've heard about Christian nationalism in the United States over the course of the last year or so. Another similarity right here, his increasingly authoritarian turn, with a crackdown on dissent that has created a chilling environment of self-censorship, has pushed India's vociferous democracy closer to a one-party state, his critics say. And the country's economic growth, while rapid, has mostly enriched those at the top. Again, all of these things are narratives told about Donald Trump. When the censorship in this country, for instance, is finally eliminated and people are just out there telling the truth to one another, the dissenting voices at that time, which are the empowered voices right now, will indeed begin to self-censor. That's not because they're being oppressed by anyone. It's because their ideas are abhorrent. And without the power of the state behind them and without the illusion of majority behind them, the incentive and punishment structure will have reversed on them. It will not be, for instance, a woke and noble thing to support late-term abortion or open borders immigration. I would never want these ideas to be censored or disallowed from the conversation, but they will be shamed out of the conversation. And they should be, because those ideas are embarrassing for anyone to hold. That's why the censorship is necessary. Mr. Modi rose from a humble background as the son of a tea seller, becoming India's most powerful and popular leader in decades by building a cult of personality, spending big on infrastructure and welfare, and tilting India's democratic institutions in his favor. Oh no, those democratic institutions. Once you threaten those, once you turn those against the people who set them up, they stop being democratic. Democratic institutions is an awfully weird phrase to begin with, by the way. If they are truly democratic, aren't they just doing what the people want them to do? Or do they mean democratic in the sense that they are just elements of the global regime put in place in all of these different countries around the world? The ultimate goal was to cement his standing as one of the most consequential prime ministers in India's nearly 75 years as a republic and make the BJP the country's only plausible national governing force. But the results on Tuesday pointed to a sharp turnaround for India's beleaguered main opposition party, the Indian National Congress, which had been seen by many as irrevocably weakened after big losses in the previous two elections. The once dominant Congress, long positioned at India's political center, struggled for years to find a direction and offer an ideological alternative to the BJP. But it and its coalition partners found traction in this election by attacking Mr. Modi's government over issues like unemployment, social justice, and the prime minister's ties to India's billionaires. And again, I just want to reiterate, like we discussed on Tuesday with Claudia Sheinbaum, we don't have to agree with these people's political ideologies. The good twin, evil twin faction is what's important. We can want everyone around the world to have conservative values or Christian values or capitalist values or whatever values you believe are important when running a successful nation. We can want them to promote and practice those values. But ultimately, these are not our countries. We are not the people who should make the decisions for the Indian people. It is up to them who they want to lead them. What we can hope for are leaders who care about sovereignty and nationalism and populism, because they will be opposing the global regime and the implementation of the regime's agenda alongside us. People thought I was insane the other day for suggesting that Claudia Sheinbaum may end up working as Donald Trump's partner south of the border, based on problems with her background and ideology. But her mentor is AMLO. She's focused, reportedly, on sovereign, nationalist, populist priorities. And our priority should be whether or not someone is going to be an ally in the struggle against the global regime, not whether they call themselves conservatives or espouse conservative values, for instance. We have plenty of those people here in the United States who are as committed to the advancement of the global regime as the worst communists in the world. The labels, as reported, simply are not enough to go on. It is the good twin, evil twin factor at play. Last year, as Rahul Gandhi, the public face of the Congress Party, sought to burnish his standing by leading long marches across India, the BJP ensnared him in a court case that led to his expulsion from Parliament. He was later returned to his seat by India's highest court and was set to win re-election on Tuesday. Speaking as early returns came in, Mr. Gandhi, 53, said the fight was not just against the BJP. It was also, he said, against all the government institutions that had stood with Mr. Modi in trying to hamstring the opposition through arrests and other punitive actions. This was about saving the Constitution, he said, lifting a small copy that he had been carrying with him and displaying during speeches on the campaign trail. Exit polls released on Saturday after more than 6 weeks of voting. Wow, what does that sound like? In the world's largest democratic exercise, indicated that Mr. Modi's party was headed toward an easy victory. But there had been signs during the campaign that Mr. Modi was worried about the outcome. He crisscrossed the country for more than 200 rallies over about 2 months and gave dozens of interviews, hoping to use his charismatic appeal to paper over any weaknesses in his party. In speeches, he often veered from his party's message of a rising India to counter accusations that he privileged business and caste elites. I imagine we're going to hear Narratives about that with Donald Trump. He's not saying the things that the Republican Party has agreed to run on. The Uniparty right, along with its partners on the Uniparty left and in the Uniparty media, will attempt to frame the conversation and the debate which key issues should be discussed and which shouldn't, and Donald Trump will end up defying all of that. Then the media will say that Donald Trump is harming the ability of Republicans to be elected. So when down-ballot Uniparty races are stolen, it'll be Donald Trump's fault once again. Modi also abandoned his once subtle dog whistles, targeting India's 200 million Muslims, instead demonizing them directly by name. As things stood by nightfall, Mr. Modi would need at least 33 seats from allies to cross the 272 minimum for forming a government. Two regional parties in particular would be kingmakers: the Telugu Desam Party in the southern state of Andhra Pradesh with 16 seats, and the Janata Dal United Party in the eastern state of Bihar with 12. Both parties are avowedly secular, raising hopes among Mr. Modi's opponents that their influence could slow down his race to turn India's democracy into a Hindu-first state. Some of Mr. Modi's biggest losses came in India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, in the north, with about 240 million people. His party leads the state government and had won 62 of the state's 80 seats in the national parliament's lower house in the previous election in 2019. You might remember hearing about Uttar Pradesh back during the very deadly pandemic. They were the massive Indian state that gave people ivermectin. Here's a headline from PolitiFact on November 12, 2021. No scientific basis for claims of ivermectin's success in Uttar Pradesh, India. Recorded cases have fallen, but there's no consensus about why. As counting ended its last stretch in the evening on Tuesday, the BJP was leading in only 33 seats there. In his own constituency, Varanasi, Mr. Modi's victory margin was reduced from 500,000 last time to about 150,000. The loss in Faizabad constituency in particular told the story of how some of the prime minister's biggest offerings had struggled to connect with voters. The constituency is home to the lavish Ram Temple in Ayodhya, built on grounds disputed between Hindus and Muslims. Its construction was a cornerstone of the nearly century-old Hindu nationalist movement that had swept Mr. Modi to power. He hoped that its grand inauguration just before the election campaign began would unite his Hindu support base and bring new supporters into the fold. Some BJP workers said that the party's flaunting of the temple may have made a large section of Hindus at the bottom of the rigid caste hierarchy uncomfortable. The opposition had painted Mr. Modi as pursuing an upper caste agenda that denied underprivileged Hindus opportunities to reverse centuries of oppression. To offset potential losses in his Hindi-speaking northern stronghold, Mr. Modi had set a lofty goal for this election to gain a foothold in the country's more prosperous south. He broke some new ground in Kerala, a state dominated by the political left and long hostile to his ideology. But overall in the south, he struggled to improve on the 29 seats out of 129 that his party had won in the previous election. Perhaps the biggest disappointment for the BJP in southern India was that it once again appeared not to have won any of the 40 seats in Tamil Nadu, a state with its own strong cultural and linguistic identity. So that is the big picture official story from Regime Media, letting you know exactly what to think about this Indian election. Yes, Modi won, but not by as much as he could have. Yes, he will stay in power with a stable majority, but it was supposed to be a landslide. And yes, he has the best approval ratings of any politician in the world covered by that Morning Consult tracker, and also happens to be that guy in the most populous nation in the world, but they don't like him that much. Let's get some more viewpoint from the old gray lady. This is an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday. Indian voters have finally woken up. For weeks, the announcement of India's election results loomed as a moment of dread for millions of people who cherish the country's commitment to secular democracy. Throughout the marathon voting process, it was considered a near inevitability that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has galvanized his right-wing Hindu base with assaults on India's founding values, minorities, and basic decency, would win a third straight thumping victory. So assured was his Bharatiya Janata Party of winning an even larger share of parliamentary seats that in the long build-up to the general election, it taunted opponents with the slogan, this time, 400 plus, talking about the number of seats they'd win. But as the election results began rolling out on Tuesday, it was as if someone snapped their fingers and India emerged from a long period of hypnosis. And that's rather hilarious. All indications suggested a massive win for Modi, but when the results were finally released, something happened. Mr. Modi, who recently claimed that his birth was not a biological event, but that he had been sent by God, failed to even deliver his party a simple parliamentary majority, leaving it unable to form a government on its own. He will probably remain prime minister for another 5-year term, but his spell over voters seems to have been broken, and with it, Hindutva. I hope I'm saying that correctly. The BJP's project to turn India into a majoritarian Hindu nationalist state may have finally hit a roadblock. As for Modi's claim that his birth was not a biological event, the New York Times article links to CNN, where that link is dead. There is another article on CNN discussing this same idea. Here is the message. I'm convinced that God has sent me for a purpose, and when that purpose is finished, my work will be done. This is why I have dedicated myself to God. God doesn't reveal his cards. He just keeps making me do things. He said, when my mother was alive, I had believed that perhaps my birth was a biological one. But after her death, when I look at my life experiences, I'm convinced that God has sent me here. God has, Modi said, made him, quote, nothing but an instrument. That sounds like an awakening to faith, not a claim to being the product of a divine birth or immaculate conception or anything like that. But of course, they're framing him as a Hindu nationalist. They are making the religious thing a huge issue. They're claiming he's going to ruin India's secular democracy, so you got to make him sound like an extremist. Those do not sound like particularly extreme statements to me. Mr. Modi has towered over India since first sweeping to power in 2014. He has now diminished. In the 2019 elections, his party won 303 of the 543 seats. His government, which also included 50 parliamentarians from minor coalition partners, ran roughshod over the opposition. This time, Mr. Modi's party has secured a far fewer 240 seats, but will be able to form another coalition government with the help of partners who are needed more than ever. The opposition India Alliance, formed by the once dominant Indian National Congress and more than 24 mostly regional parties, nearly equaled the BJP tally despite a deeply unfair electoral playing field. During its 10 years in power, Mr. Modi's party has, in the style of authoritarian regimes, captured or subverted nearly every significant institution in India. One of the richest political parties in the world, it created a fundraising mechanism declared unconstitutional by India's Supreme Court earlier this year to take advantage of anonymous political donations. What does that sound like? Cryptocurrency donations, Bitcoin donations. Who just suggested doing that? Who just started doing that? Donald Trump. And again, Modi enjoys the highest approval ratings in the world. So if you assume that's true, and you're claiming that Modi has captured or subverted nearly every significant institution, then clearly the people wanted him to do that. The party has gone after its rivals using government agencies, tying them up in endless investigations, freezing party bank accounts, and even jailing 2 chief ministers from opposition-controlled states in the run-up to the vote. The BJP has used its power, money, and pressure to split other political parties and engineer defections. It has effectively turned major television broadcasters and newspapers into propaganda arms, financially rewarding those who play ball and turning enforcement agencies on those who do not. And again, all of it will be said about Donald Trump, about MAGA in the future, while they do the work of the American people, that the American people have empowered Donald Trump and his allies to do. The government-controlled media treated the election as a contest between a predestined natural winner and a bunch of wannabes. In the end, the opposition India alliance with the Congress Party's Rahul Gandhi as its national face won over voters who had suffered the consequences of Modi's governance failures and the misinformation it propagated through the media. The Young Alliance shattered Mr. Modi's aura of invincibility with a back-to-basics message that focused on the Prime Minister's failure to deliver even minimal economic gains for many citizens who face historically high unemployment, rising prices, and growing inequality while financial markets have boomed. We are going to hear all of those things about Donald Trump as well. Globalist money will be sucked out of the system. All of the statistics and reports that are massaged, to put it lightly, in favor of the regime agenda will be interpreted to make Trump and the America First agenda look bad and unsuccessful, and the people will ignore that, but the global regime's propaganda media will spread that message to the rest of the world. To have hope in the India alliance, this is INDIA, by the way, they have very clever acronyms, might have felt like a leap of faith. But its performance in the election is an important declaration that there are still parties in India that are, despite their differences and the culture of fear that has helped to sustain Mr. Modi, united by a commitment to constitutional values and the will to stand against Hindutva. The alliance encompasses a wide national political base, including in states that are significantly more socially and economically advanced than many of those controlled by the ruling party. An India alliance that can build on its success and stand up to Mr. Modi will be good news for the country. Earlier this year, Mr. Modi, playing the priest king, inaugurated a new Hindu temple in the pilgrimage city of Ayodhya. It was the culmination of a Hindu right-wing campaign to build a temple on the site of a centuries-old mosque that was illegally demolished by a Hindu mob in 1992. The structure was supposed to represent the victory of Hindutva and the marginalization of India's 200 million Muslims, who have been vilified by Mr. Modi and violently attacked by Hindu mobs, and ensure that Hindu voters would carry him to an easy victory. But even with the temple, plus a new airport in Ayodhya, new roads, and a revamped railway station to bring in worshippers, his party lost the parliamentary seat of Faizabad constituency where Ayodhya is located, as the INDIA's coalition campaign focused attention on Mr. Modi's governance failures and the BJP's goal of changing the country's inclusive constitution. The Prime Minister scraped the bottom of the barrel, going beyond even his usual dog whistles and portraying the opposition as posed to essentially hand the country over to Muslims. Yet Mr. Modi's ramped-up anti-Muslim rhetoric appears not to have helped him, and may even have hurt him. Mr. Modi himself retained his parliamentary seat, but by a narrower margin than in the last election. The India coalition has cut Mr. Modi down to size and reopened the country's political space. Mr. Modi will remain in power, but there is cautious hope that his government, dependent for survival on coalition partners who do not espouse Hindutva, will have less latitude to undermine democracy or terrorize Muslims and government critics, and that parliament and state institutions such as the courts will once again function as they should. On the ground, the changes wrought by Mr. Modi's Hindutva movement over the last 10 years have not been uprooted. There is much work to be done. but supporters of a secular democratic India can now breathe a bit easier. The Financial Times on Tuesday published an article with the headline, Narendra Modi set to lose parliamentary majority in shock Indian election result. I'm not going to go through all of this, but skipping down, exit polls released over the weekend projected the ruling alliance between 353 and 401 seats. During the campaign, Modi and the BJP forecast the NDA would win as many as 400 seats. If the numbers don't change, it's a return of alliance politics that had characterized India from 1989 to 2014, said Pratap Bhanu Mehta, senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. In that sense, it will have to be a much more negotiated government. I'm not sure how much business will like it. Further down, government officials had trumpeted an ambitious economic reform agenda. India has been one of the world's fastest growing economies since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Prime Minister had expressed a target of becoming the world's third largest economy from the fifth biggest currently during his third term in office, and a developed economy by 2047, the centenary of independence. And wow, that's just a couple years before China was supposed to be completing its 100-year mission. Skipping down further, ahead of the vote, some opposition figures had questioned the integrity of India's electronic voting machines and accused the Modi government of a pre-election crackdown after some Congress bank accounts were frozen and two opposition figures jailed in corruption probes. However, some commentators took Tuesday's result as evidence that Indian voters were still free to exercise their will. You see that? It was going to be cheating if Modi got the big result that was expected by Modi, by his party, by exit polls, by everyone. If they got that result, it would have been from cheating with electronic voting machines, but they didn't. So therefore, that's evidence that Indian voters were still free to exercise their will. And you might remember that period during Trump's first term when prominent Democrats were out there talking about how the election machines in the United States were unreliable and wide open, vulnerable to manipulations. They had an entire mainstream documentary about it called Kill Chain, released on HBO. But then in 2020, when those same voting machines generated the result the Uniparty wanted, it was a conspiracy theory to suggest that there was a problem with the electronic voting machines. So they can't figure out whether or not Modi and his party were going to rig this election. Modi has the highest approval rating of any leader in the world, was expected to win by a whole heck of a lot, and then didn't do nearly as well as expected. And that's what proves that there was no cheating. But let's look a little further into that. This is from Al Jazeera. A couple months back, March 29th, 2024, the headline, Can India's Election Be Rigged? Ahead of vote, old debate gets new life. And the picture attached to this article is an Indian man on his cell phone walking past some awful looking piece of propaganda art, a woman's hand with one outstretched finger about to tap a button on an electronic voting machine screen. This is apparently artwork. It is a giant hand sticking out of the ground. I encourage you to have a look at this article. You can find that, as always, in the Telegram info stream, t.me/veryreasonable. As he launched the main Indian opposition alliance's election campaign in the middle of March, Congress Party leader Rahul Gandhi hit out at two targets: Narendra Modi, who he described as the king, and the electronic voting machines that the country uses to cast ballots. The soul of the king is in the EVM, Gandhi said in Mumbai. That's the electronic voting machine, the EVM. The allegation that the machines can be hacked and that Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party owes its electoral dominance over India to that malpractice, even though multiple opinion polls suggest the Prime Minister's party is resoundingly the favorite among voters in many parts of the country. The charge isn't new. The Congress and some other opposition parties have previously, too, questioned the trustworthiness of EVMs, machines that are not connected to the internet, yet run on chips that critics say could, in theory, be programmed to record votes in a way that doesn't match the buttons that voters press. The Election Commission of India, which conducts the country's votes, and even the Supreme Court have rubbished these allegations, and no conclusive evidence has emerged yet to substantiate the claims. But as India now heads for national elections over 7 drawn-out phases starting April 19th, Gandhi has made the possibility of election fraud a central talking point. The Congress leader, who has been on a long march, is demanding that India return to the paper ballots it used in elections until the late 1990s, which were counted manually. That demand was rejected last week by the Supreme Court. The Election Commission called it a regressive proposal. Yet the chorus of demands from the Congress and its supporters isn't going away, even though opposition parties lead governments in almost half of the country's states, formed through elections also conducted using EVMs, elections that they won. Congress leader Digvijay Singh, the former chief minister of the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, is a consistent campaigner against the machines. He leads a loosely built group of critics from the country's opposition parties and nonprofits demanding a return to paper ballots. Ritu Singh, a young Dalit academic, has been going viral on YouTube, X, and Instagram with her comments, speeches, and videos in which she alleges that Indian democracy has been imperiled by EVMs. In New Delhi, traditional Congress voter Gregory Eka said he no longer trusts the elections. We all vote for the Congress, but we do not know where our vote goes. Till there is EVM, BJP would continue to be in power. To build confidence in the EVMs, the Election Commission in 2013 introduced the Voter Verifiable Paper Audit Trail, or VVPAT, which is a slip of paper that is visible to the voter for 7 seconds before it slides into a box kept alongside the voting machine. On the paper, a voter can check whether their ballot has been recorded correctly. Oh yeah, that'll do it. In 2017, the Election Commission decided that votes on VVPAT slips would be counted in a handful of polling stations in every constituency to randomly test whether the tallies matched with those shown by EVMs. The Congress and some other opposition parties are now demanding that VVPAT slips be counted for all polling stations across the country. But veteran election officers and independent analysts say the opposition is mistaken in questioning the credibility of EVMs. Former Chief Election Commissioner S.Y. Qureshi is convinced that any election rigging cannot be through EVM. He said he supports counting VVPAT slips to rebuild trust in the Election Commission as an independent body that holds elections. Even if it takes more days to count these VVPAT slips to match the EVM count, it should be done, he said. And of course, we understand from our experience with electronic voting machines here in the United States that printing out a paper receipt doesn't mean anything. Even when your selections are properly recorded, the machine can still be set up in such a way that the counts are manipulated, and when the machine produces the receipt that is not a ballot, it is just a receipt. The paper evidence can be produced after the fact, as it is here. Now, I'm not suggesting that I am any sort of expert on India's election systems. I'm just making the comparison. If they have some blockchain backup or some other verifiable element, then maybe that makes a difference. But trusting these machines is insane. But any electoral malpractice that might happen occurs before the actual voting, he said, this being Qureshi. Elections can be won or lost before elections. Before every election, the Election Commission puts out advertisements asking voters to check their names in the voter list to make sure they haven't been accidentally removed. If they do not check, how can ECI be blamed? Qureshi said. So you see, the people have to check to see if their name is there. But the problem that doesn't solve is, what if there are tens of millions of other names also in those voter rolls that don't correspond to actual voters? Yet maintaining and updating electoral rolls accurately and fairly is no easy task. Weeding out names that are either duplicated or of people who have died is critical, said an election commission official who requested anonymity. After COVID, many names had to be removed. And how about this little nugget after I mentioned earlier that all COVID deaths are data malpractice or medical malpractice? According to the World Health Organization, almost 4 million Indians died in the pandemic, though the Indian government's estimation is much lower. How about that? Many civil society activists fear that the revision of electoral rolls is used to remove voters who are inconvenient for the government of the day. Civil society groups, you say, always a euphemism for global regime organizations in a given country. And as it is here, they are claiming that any purge of voter rolls constitutes voter suppression. Ahead of the 2019 elections, activists said tens of millions of Muslim and Dalit voters were removed from the electoral list, prompting fears of a suppressed turnout from segments of the population that often do not vote for Modi or the BJP. Will they say that exact same thing when all of the illegal aliens who have been registered to vote at places like the DMVs in the United States of America are removed from those voter rolls? Yes, of course they will. Same narrative playbooks playing out all over the world, slightly different times, cyclically, slightly different variations. So let's have a look back at the 2019 election in India. This is a website called The Wire in India. August 13th, 2023 was the 2019 Lok Sabha election really manipulated. A research paper by Ashoka University scholar Sabyasachi Das, titled Democratic Backsliding in the World's Largest Democracy, seems to have stirred the hornet's nest in certain political circles. Das published a paper in the background of the credibility of the Election Commission of India being called into question, with allegations of bias in scheduling of elections and arbitrary deletions of the names of registered Muslim voters. Both of these will have favored the ruling BJP. Some of Das's findings are deeply disturbing. The article goes through a few examples, but let's skip down. Inexplicably, Das did not consider the possibility of the manipulation of electronic voter machines or EVMs themselves as a mechanism, on the assumption that they are hard to manipulate at scale. There is ample material in the public domain questioning the sanctity of India's electoral process, mainly due to severe flaws in EVM voting and voter verifiable paper audit trail counting. That's VVPAT. These do not comply with essential electoral and democracy requirements of end-to-end verifiability and principles which stipulate that each voter have the knowledge and capacity to verify that their vote is cast as intended, recorded as cast, and counted as recorded. The ECI arranged for all EVMs to be accompanied with VVPAT for the 2019 parliament elections. Experts are of the view that the Jugaad-like way the VVPAT device has been inserted into India's electronic voting process has endangered security, and that the process safeguards that were earlier designed to protect EVMs have lost their value. The fact is that though the device is called voter verifiable paper audit trail, it has been reduced to the level of a fancy bioscope which shows a tiny paper slip for 7 seconds, which then vanishes and is significantly not counted. And there is no semblance of verifiability by the voter, only a brief sighting. It is a grand deception being played on the Indian voter who is exercising her fundamental right to elect her representative to govern the country on her behalf. This matter, so crucial to India's democracy, went before the Supreme Court in 2018. They essentially decided to increase the number of checks. This increased the sample size from microscopic 0.5% to a minuscule 2%, against the demand for 30 to 50%. The court also summarily dismissed the review petition on May 7, 2019. The request to the ECI to count at least manually the measly 2% VVPAT slips up front and do the verification before the main electronic count was rudely rejected. In the 2019 election, not even one VVPAT slip was counted and matched before the entire electronic count was done and the results were made public. This gave rise to the distinct possibility of voting and counting manipulation. So they wanted to be able to check the machine results against a paper audit trail. The courts, which seem to just decide what the laws are as some sort of supreme governing authority, as the regime tries to create in all of the countries around the world, including here, they're trying to create that here, that the Supreme Court would be the ultimate authority on just about everything. They went from checking the electronic results and comparing them to the VVPAT slips from 1 in every 200 ballots to 1 in every 50 ballots, which is still totally insufficient to be able to actually determine accuracy. Now let's get the regime's point of view on these electronic voting machines. This is from the Brookings Institution, where Norm Eisen, the author of The Color Revolution, is a senior fellow. April 5th, 2019, the headline, India's Electoral Democracy, How EVMs Curb Electoral Fraud. As India gears up for the 2019 general elections, 900 million voters will cast their ballots across approximately 1 million polling booths in India. Free and fair elections are the linchpin of democracy, but elections in India have been marred by money, power, and frauds. In the paper, The Impact of Electronic Voting Machines on Electoral Frauds, Democracy, and Development, authors provide evidence suggesting that the introduction of EVMs to replace paper ballots reduced electoral fraud in India, making elections fairer, safer, and more competitive. Their findings show that voter turnout declined, suggesting fewer fake ballots. And the vote shares of incumbents decreased, suggesting more competitive elections and less manipulation by those in power. To address fraud and simplify electoral procedure, the Election Commission of India introduced EVMs in the late 1990s. A serious concern with the use of paper ballots in India was booth capturing, where party loyalists would occupy a polling booth by force and stuff the ballot box with fake ballots and then cover the windows with pizza. That's here. EVMs were designed to discourage such fraud by limiting the rate of casting votes to 5 per minute. This feature increased the time required to cast false ballots, providing a larger time frame for security forces to arrive and intervene. There is also a close button to disable the device in the event that a polling booth is captured by force. Oh, so they can just turn the machines off? Wait a second. Greater transparency is created by the fact that electronic voting signatures and thumb impressions are maintained in a register open to public inspection, which is in contrast to paper balloting, where inspection took place only under court orders and where the validity of any ballot was determined at the discretion of an election officer. They go through some of the turnout statistics, writing, the paper finds that the decline in number of voters was substantially higher in states prone to electoral fraud, where politicians faced serious criminal charges. At the same time, the paper uses post-poll surveys conducted by the Center for the Study of Developing Societies to show that turnout for vulnerable groups, such as women, schedules, castes, and tribes, senior citizens, and illiterate voters increased after EVMs were introduced. EVMs increased the likelihood of a less educated voter casting their ballot by 6.4%, empowering vulnerable groups. These facts together suggest that reduced overall turnout was due to a reduced number of false ballots or less fraud, rather than other factors such as longer lines or voter aversion to new technology. So the big problem before the EVMs was all of the ballot-related fraud, all of the false ballots that were flooded into the system. Now, I don't expect that we will have a legitimate election in the United States this year, but if we do, one of the features of that legitimate election would be a reduced turnout, because part of the election's legitimacy will be removing all of those false registrations that end up having votes cast for them. Now, the central narrative will not be able to handle that fact, so it'll be presented with a cover story about why voters are less enthused to go out and vote. The Brookings article notes that they have ECI observers to monitor the elections in every constituency. And they go on, electronic voting has also resulted in a substantial decrease in the number of rejected votes. While on a paper ballot, an unclear stamping can lead to a rejection of the ballot, an EVM allows only one push of a button to register a vote. The paper finds that the introduction of EVMs led to the elimination of almost all rejected votes, resulting in a 2.7% increase in the number of valid votes at the baseline. In an election with narrow margins of victory, such an improvement could change the outcome. Yes, it sounds like an improvement for sure. Again, they had all those fake ballots when they were using paper ballots. They just had to reject all those ballots before. Now, those fake ballots aren't coming in, so they don't have to reject them. It's impossible, you see, to reject false ballots when there are no ballots. In conclusion, we learned that the introduction of EVMs had a number of significant effects on the electoral process, which strongly suggest a reduced incidence of fraud and malpractice, namely a reduction in voter turnout, especially in states with politicians with criminal backgrounds, an increase in turnout and the ability to cast a vote among vulnerable groups, a reduction in the number of rejected ballots, and a reduction in the vote shares of the incumbent parties. And I would have to guess that because these results are somehow desirable for the Brookings Institution and their ideological allies around the world, this would suggest that the electronic voting machines are good. But again, as we've already seen today, and we already know in the United States, if you can't verify the results that the machines produce, and they can't, then the idea that the machines somehow produce a more accurate tally, an election with greater integrity, is nonsense, which is why the experts, our betters, prefer to focus on these metrics that don't actually say anything about a lack of fraud. Lower turnout in states where they claim the politicians have criminal backgrounds, higher turnout among vulnerable groups. Even if I agreed that those would be desirable outcomes, they are no indication that the machines have reduced election fraud. And of course, the machines can't reduce election fraud. The machines are literally designed to enable election fraud, which is why they don't just add 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. So they have a different system in India. They have a parliament, and the leader of the majority party or the majority coalition is the prime minister. That happens to be Narendra Modi. But that position is more in line with what we might consider the Speaker of the House in the United States. All of the members of the House are essentially elected to the same position, congressmen, and then the leader of one party represents the entire body. So in that system, the leader representing that body could be extremely popular with no chance of electoral defeat, but that does not mean the same for that leader's party. Consider Nancy Pelosi, for instance. California elections are rigged beyond imagination. Nancy Pelosi never has to debate in primaries. She never has to debate in general elections because she's always running against a Democrat. She has full financial control, full control of the party, full backing of the party, and totally rigged elections in California, through machines, by the way, in case all the rest of it fails. But that doesn't mean that that system exists throughout the country. Different systems exist throughout the 50 states. Elections could be rigged in some states and not in others. The degree of rigging could be different between states, and elections can be rigged to benefit different parties. The party affiliation of the winner of a congressional election gives no indication whatsoever on whether or not the election that person won was legitimately held. So much like we will see with Donald Trump this fall, his popularity may prove to be no indicator at all of how Republicans down ballot actually perform, or at least how the results of those races are reported. Modi's popularity, the exit polls, all expectations were turned upside down with these reported results. Their elections are held with machines totally unverifiable. All sorts of claims of problems in the past. The opposition party even claiming that there would be problems in this election. And then when their result was so overwhelmingly good for them, they said this is proof that there was not cheating. Think about how that will work in America when Donald Trump says he's going to win by a lot. We start hearing about problems with electronic voting again. We are convinced that Trump will have a massive win. Republicans down ballot will do well. And then once again, Joe Biden receives 90 million votes, 100 million votes. Democrats do amazingly well down ballot. The machines will be just fine again. In fact, the whole election system, according to the media, according to the Uniparty, will be just fine. They have to preserve that election system. And they probably thought they were prepared to. And then they get a result that they didn't expect, that the regime didn't expect. This seems to be the scenario that is emerging right now in India. This is from today in Bloomberg. India exit polls spark criticism, tears, and calls for probes. India's wildly inaccurate exit polls predicting a landslide election victory for Narendra Modi's party sparked dramatic public apologies from polling companies this week and calls for them to be investigated for possible manipulation. Almost all of the exit polls released on June 1st forecast Modi's BJP and its allies would win more than 350 seats in the lower house of parliament. The final results, released 3 days later, put the coalition's tally at just 293 seats. The exit polls pushed the benchmark equity index to a record on Monday, followed by a crash a day later when almost $400 billion of value was wiped off the market. Opposition parties called on the country's stock market regulator and the parliament to investigate the polling companies and BJP leaders for possible rigging. People very high up in the BJP have carried out a scam. Rahul Gandhi, a key leader in the main opposition Indian National Congress, told reporters Thursday, "We'd like to know if these polls were actually carried out, what was the methodology of the polls, and who are the investors." Prior to the exit polls, Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah had predicted rallies in the stock market, with the Prime Minister saying it would hit record highs on the day of election results. Again, this sounds exactly like Donald Trump. If I win, the stock market's going to go up, 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 record highs. You've never seen it so high. If I lose, everything is going to crash. That's essentially what Modi did, and Modi is being accused, therefore, of manipulation. BJP spokespeople and Modi's office didn't immediately respond to calls and an email seeking further information. Pradeep Gupta of the polling company Axios My India denied the allegations of manipulation when contacted by phone. While exit polls have a patchy record in India, in 2004 they also predicted a comfortable majority for the BJP-led alliance, which didn't transpire. Polling has been generally accurate in 2014 and 2019. Reasons for the large miss this year are varied. Political analysts point to structural challenges of conducting surveys in a country of almost 1 billion voters, limited resources, and inherent biases in surveys. They also suggest there are inadequate sample sizes and logistical problems in covering 543 parliamentary constituencies across the country. These are all what you might call very lame excuses. The polling companies, however, all have stood behind their data. And the article goes on. But the attacks in media are against the polling companies and the exit polling companies. The claim is that they rigged their results to back Modi's narrative about how successful the BJP would be in the election. And all of the companies were off by an enormous margin. Now, the regime can't blame election fraud or manipulation for any of that, so you might as well blame the polling companies and then suggest that they were doing it for some corrupt purpose. And I'm certainly not saying that couldn't happen, by the way. You might remember some major polling misses in 2016 when they thought there was like a 98% chance Hillary Clinton was going to win, and that just melted away over the course of the evening. There was a post released on, I think, Election Day or maybe the day before in 2020 from Wisconsin that showed Joe Biden expected to win by 7. And while he was declared the winner of Wisconsin and people pretend that he actually did win in Wisconsin, that election was held unconstitutionally. And there are very likely hundreds of thousands of votes included in that tally that do not constitute real lawful American votes. And let's conclude with this piece from RT. This is Russia Today, Russian state media. This is information coming from a media group whose interests are not in serving the global regime. Election outcome won't alter India's foreign policy, according to experts. There will be continuity in India's foreign policy, irrespective of who comes to power, as a result of the recently concluded general election, senior diplomats told RT as votes were being counted on Tuesday. The broad contours of our foreign policy will remain the same, Manju Seth, a former ambassador and consul general of India to Madagascar and Comoros, told RT. The guest asserted that New Delhi would continue to maintain its quote-unquote strategic autonomy and its quote-unquote multilateral approach toward dealing with other nations. India would also continue pressing for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, the former diplomat asserted. The beauty of Indian foreign policy is that it doesn't change drastically. Because it is formulated based on national interest, it does not change. It remains more or less constant, according to Ambassador Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs. He too suggested, however, that, quote, there will be little tweaking and nuancing, end quote, of the country's foreign policy. The Indian election is being watched closely worldwide as the country's foreign policy had been perceived by many analysts as more assertive under Modi's administration. Most recently, the South Asian country's policy on the global stage has been marked by balancing ties with both Moscow and Western partners. After the outbreak of the Ukraine conflict, India refused to condemn Russia and maintained its defense and commercial relations, ramping up oil purchases despite scrutiny from the West. India also stressed the need for the peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. The rise in the assertiveness of New Delhi's role on the global stage has coincided with the sharp rise of its economy. It is now worth $3.7 trillion, making it the fifth largest in the world. By the end of the decade, it is expected to become the third largest, beating Germany and Japan. However, there might be some rethinking regarding the country's policy toward neighbors if the Indian National Developmental Inclusive Alliance, or India Alliance, led by the Congress Party, comes to power. Development and inclusivity are basically curse words at this point. New Delhi has been actively pursuing its neighborhood-first policy aimed at enhancing political, trade, and interpersonal cooperation with its peers in the region, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. This is beginning to sound like regions of responsibility, something that is talked about consistently in the sovereign alliance paradigm, with the move to the multipolar world rather than that one world, liberal, international, rules-based order. And we should all take note there of Myanmar, a country that has successfully kicked out the global regime. It seems to be that they are under the watch of India and Narendra Modi. While the Modi government has maintained robust relations with most of its neighbors, ties have arguably deteriorated with China and Pakistan, with whom the country has long-standing border disputes. Some of the smaller nations in the region, too, have been increasingly a focus of India's foreign policy when seen as diplomatically inching toward Beijing. Whoever comes into power and forms the government will have to be very nimble-footed and devise its foreign policy approaches with the changing geopolitical environment, which is rapidly evolving, Seth asserted. Now, shocking election outcomes always suggest that something has gone wrong. Either something was manipulated or a manipulation was removed. It's possible that election fraud happened, causing politicians of opposition parties to win races they should not have won. It's also possible that members of Modi's party who were in their seats at the behest of the global regime, the way uniparty Republicans are in the United States, may have had the benefit of election manipulation removed from them. So the majority would be reduced, but at the same time, so would the corrupt influence of the global regime. It will be very important to understand all of these dynamics as we get into the so-called election season this fall. But it seems as though the sovereign nationalist movement around the world, the Sovereign Alliance, as some people call it, the multipolar world order, continues to advance. I will be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!